and share whatever it is you have to share before you have to leave for whatever other obligations that you have. But we're going to try to stick to program and with that one wrinkle if needed, and get through as much of this as we possibly can. So with your permission, I'm going to give you one person's take on what happened in Reno, and let that sponsor or encourage a discussion from us all on did I get the interpretation of Reno correctly, and is there other material there that we should maybe be thinking about in some sort of more expansive kind of way? So let's see, Jennifer, can you see the slideshow okay? Good. So let me again qualify this by saying there's a team, the leadership team really didn't have a lot of time to work out and process what happened in Reno. We had discussions about it and they guided me on important messaging and so forth. But I want to qualify this saying this is Mike Friedenberg's kind of look at what happened in Reno as your facilitator and simultaneously an observer. So this is not the end all be all that's there. It's just one person's take to kind of get the conversation moving. And so let's roll in and see what is it that is lessons learned there. Let me do a couple of reminders. First, about the assembly purpose. That's the meeting in Reno that we termed an assembly. It was really to sponsor two really broad conversations. One was, what does the configuration of the Western Water Network look like, and what does those many ramifications look like in terms of operations, but also duties that the group might want to self-assign itself. And then the second huge purpose was to look ahead to this water congress that is on everybody's mind to sponsor in early part of 2023 as a way to really have a major kickoff event that moves the ball forward in creating activism for the Western Water Network, where they actually start doing real work with people and on the ground. Another reminder is that the design of the Reno conference had all of these elements in it. We talked about the assembly purpose. Mike Gaffney's keynote was seminal in that, so we're going to review that a little bit here today. And then we had, if you look at the numbered items 1 through 6, really about 6 working sessions in the Reno. And we're going to review each of those by number here today. So we're going to follow those numbers as we go around this mind map. And we talked about things like adding value and capacity, organizing the network, what are some priority water topics, the Congress, of course, Congress deliverables, and then what is it we should be thinking about doing after the Reno conference? What's the appropriate next steps or follow-up that should be on our to-do list? So that's what we're going to cover briefly here in a few slides. Let's begin with Mike's keynote. It was really trying to, Mike, I'm putting words in your mouth, so you can certainly correct me if I miss.
Well, you put some of the words from the keynote in my mouth, Mike, so that's perfectly appropriate.
Hey, trust indeed, but maybe trust misplaced here. We'll see how I do with it. He really tried to articulate what the starting line was in Reno that we were working from, and so that's really my challenge here, is to try to reprise that for you. And there's about 3 or 4 components that are important to bring to top of mind for the moment for this hour's conversation. First is, Mike was able to summarize that conversations and the work we've done with you and other interested parties identified a key gap that seems to be resonating pretty broadly across the whole West, and that there's a need to promote better and faster collaborations if water security in the West is going to be, we're going to move the ball towards greater security of water management in the West. So that seems to be a key starting point that everybody is on everybody's mind. The second was that there's a beginning agreement on priority water topics. The summit that we had in August of a year and a half ago, I guess now, and the survey that we did that many of you participated in, online survey, and then the thinking and writing that our team has done about that seems to isolate that there's a beginning agreement on what the priority water topics are. That's naming water topics. That is not addressing yet what you should do on those water topics, which is a huge work effort that's in everybody's future. But nonetheless, the starting line has with it a sense of agreement already on what the key water topics are. And the third key message Mike wrapped into his keynote address was that There's awareness, sensitivity, maybe some fear, definitely concern about how on earth you get folks in the West to move from a competitive mindset about water demands and their demands for water to some version of collaborations that, again, moves the ball down the court on providing for water security. So that's kind of the starting line that Mike articulated. But we've done other things as well. So there's more work that's been done that maybe you've not been able to follow. Now, briefly, what that looks like is this here, where there was the mini summit. And then our leadership team processed that into a set of talking points that came out of that was sort of trying to isolate key messages that were on people's minds a year and a half ago. The leadership team has drafted rules of operation. If you're going to have an organization like the Western Water Network, you got to figure out how it's going to operate. And so that is translated into some draft rules of operation. And then led by Travis as the senior author, but all the leadership team, they drafted a paper that's entitled Major Issues in Western Water, U.S. Water Over the Next 30 Years, which is an attempt to articulate, again, Travis, correct me if I'm wrong, but attempt to articulate what are those key issues that seem to rise to the top that is on everybody's mind. And that if we did constructive work in it, that would be a good way to think about how to compartmentalize or fractionalize or break up the work into manageable chunks. And then came the Reno meeting, where it was like the starting line just completely expanded in my mind because I felt so good about that meeting being productive. So we're going to start looking at that. This page turn that you just experienced in the PowerPoint bells and whistles arena is for purpose here today. And it's to for those numbered items that were in the mind map that I showed you, we're going to have one little module on each of those. So when you see a page turn like this, we're moving from items 1 through 6 in those key work sessions that occurred in Reno. The star around this one is just to draw your attention to the fact that we're on number 1, and you'll see these numbers change as we go along. Recall that for us, a couple of key themes in Reno was how on earth does the network add value, and how do we add capacity to the work everybody else is already doing? So there's a huge array of people working. They're doing constructive work. They're collaborating quite well already. But the question is, how does the Western Water Network add capacity to that already big body of constructive work that's going on? Here's the nature of the conversation. Again, this is one person's take on what happened in Reno. Here's the nature of the conversation that emerged in Reno. And you went through a series of themes. 2 prominently came to my mind as themes out of the Reno conference that are sort of top of mind. First is the network better darn well make sure that it does something to encourage proactive management instead of being in the reactive management mode all the time. So that's a huge theme for the network to get its mind around how you're going to do that. And then the second theme was enlarge the response footprint. Didn't seem to be any major concern at all about that, and it resonated real well that people felt comfortable if in fact we could enlarge the response footprint. So that's making the tent larger so you can get more people in the tent and affect their decision-making, their policies, their priorities, that kind of thing. But in Reno, you also went on to talk about, well, what kind of activities might implement those themes? And these are just examples. Again, these rose to the top in my trying to assimilate the meaning from Reno. So this is an example list of activities on the right. It's not the end all and be all, of course, but if we're going to produce productivity around the theme of proactive management, what kind of activities might need to be sponsored? And that's definitely in the arena of things like gaps analysis and proposing solutions around those. And what I heard through my filters, although I didn't hear from my work in climate change management, what I heard through my filters that I didn't hear terribly explicitly expressed in Reno was you're talking about potentially an unusual array of what are preventions, adaptations, and mitigations to things that might happen. So one way to be more proactive is to start sponsoring activities or work at least toward those activities around the notions of prevention of problems, adaptations when they do occur, and mitigations for once they've occurred, what are you going to do about it? So proactive management is a huge theme. Similarly, for examples on enlarging the response footprint, clearly geography is on people's minds. So how you knit together the existing network of networks, that kind of a question. Interdisciplinary networking and improvement was on everybody's minds, it sounded like. So how do you get the disciplines that are working on this unsiloed and working together towards a common purpose, that kind of a thing. User, stakeholder, management sectors, there's a lot of concern about, there's still gaps there. There is disbelief, even though there are early adopters in the notion that there are problems coming with water management. There's plenty of people who are lagging behind that curve. And so what are we going to do about it? Could be a work activity that's appropriate. Integrated planning. This is sort of the cycle of water, or one water theme that we'll talk about here in a minute. But how do you manage water from the time it starts falling till the time you can no longer access it in groundwater or whatever? Integrated planning is on people's minds. Cultivating future managers seems to be a concern. There was a bit of a surprise to me, but those of you who are responsible for preparing managers to manage in the future, you're sensing there's a gap there. And so maybe there's an activity that could be built around that. And then community stakeholder acceptance. Again, this whole question of, are people in disbelief? Or are they in denial? Are they just uninformed? Are they unorganized? What is it about the fact that there hasn't been community and stakeholder acceptance for the need for action? That could be a fruitful set of work activities to enlarge the footprint as well. So the next topic was organizing the Western Water Network itself. Just a real brief stop on this. There's going to be a lot more work done on that we don't need to cover in too much detail today, but it really is clearly around the notion of the Western Water Network's infrastructure. And so it's really all about funding and decision-making processes, and finishing the rules of procedure, staffing, and all of those kinds of things. More work on the goals. You guys were really careful and very diplomatic. Compliments to you for that, of pointing out that perhaps we've not been as clear and have the appropriate focus as we should have in setting up some goals for the network. So there's more work to be done on that. And then define the Western Water Network persona. For me, I think I saw this in the background working all the time, but you guys brought it a bit to the surface, and that there's a question about what is the degree of activism that the Western Water Network ought to have. I think that could be a really interesting debate about, are you in the more responsive mode where people want something from you, like an analysis or a set of recommendations or something that you provide, or do you lead a little bit and say, here are some gaps, and we're going to initiate some solutions that you ought to be thinking about implementing. So there's that debate that is on our future. Is a really intriguing question. And then lastly, for today's presentation anyway, just the community awareness of the Western Water Network, and setting it up as trusted advisors that people will think to call. So there's going to be that. You may have a terrific product as a Western Water Network, but do the customers even know we're here and we're available to help them? So that's on people's minds as well. A role model that came up in our subsequent discussions to Reno is that we might be talking about is something like the Northern Climate Collaborative, but with a considerably broader and more ambitious agenda, yet to be defined what broader, ambitious means, but that's in the thinking as well. Pausing here to talk about in the work that has been done. There's been quite a bit of work done since the summit in August, a year and a half ago. So our tub is starting to overflow with raw material to begin working with. And for me, Travis's work organizing us around this paper that he led for us is a good sign that there's rich material out there. But we have the summit that of course he summarizes. We have the survey, of course he summarizes, but there maybe is more insight there that could be plumbed. And then definitely what happened at Reno. So we've got a lot of raw material to begin working with, and it's more than we can hold in today's short meeting. So again, we're high grading to some impressions I had as your facilitator. So item 3 on the mind map that I showed earlier is to just remind us all what the 6 categories are for the priority water topics that Travis and the co-authors on the leadership team came up with. And we're going to use these in a moment. So this is not just a blanket reminder. These are just a reminder with a purpose to give you some insight about how you all spoke to it in Reno. So the first of the 6 categories that are in the draft paper is that there's maybe a need to work in research, extension, and education needs. So maybe that's a theme or a work effort that should be highlighted in the future. The second category is water quantity, quality, and water equity, and that is on people's minds. The third category that seems important to people is looking at spatial scales from global down to regional, down to local, and how you manage that as a network. How do you get your minds around what are the appropriate scales and how do you intervene constructively? Fourth was groundwater, surface water, and coupled surface groundwater and groundwater systems. That came out tagged and tidily named, I think, in the Reno conference as the theme of One Water. So that's on people's minds. Another category was water uses, agricultural, municipal, industrial, and ecological. How do you manage water uses, integrate them, deal with competing priorities? A lot of really rich questions there as well. And then the sixth category was data and science synthesis, communication, and implementation. And I think most of you tend to come from the academic side of this work, so that likely resonates as intuitively obvious to you. Here's what I think I heard in Reno on each of these. So this is a summary of your conversations, again, filtered through me as an observer / facilitator for you. In terms of research extension and education needs, topics that seem to rise to the surface that could be candidates for future work is themes around water allocation and use. And so doing research, doing extension work, and doing education on water allocation and how you deal with that and use in general seems to be, could be a potentially appropriate and beneficial response to that category. I'm going to go through the others a little bit more rapidly, not just get the pattern of what I'm up to here in presenting. Next is efficiency, effectiveness, and equity and security for water quality. That seemed to be themes that popped up in Reno. For spatial scale, it's the unit of analysis for data collection and decision making. Well, what are the appropriate units and how do you intervene in those units at the appropriate scale? That's a good question. The coupled water systems, it's the one water concept. And acceptance of a limited pie could be people still perhaps in good faith, but still living in a fool's paradise, thinking that there's more water out there than there really is. On the ride to the airport in Reno, I struck up a conversation with the driver of the limousine, and he said, I told him about the conference, and you guys are worried about preserving water security and make sure there's enough for the future. The instinctive response he had as a citizen was, there's plenty of water out there. We just got to go look for it. So that's sort of, I know it's a sidebar little story, but it had an impact on me of illustrating the notion of how you get through to people and the importance of it. Water uses, that seems to be themed around from Reno, the notion of allocation and what is best use. Of course, huge debates are going to be centered around those questions, but that seems to be the crux that came out of Reno as topics worth exploring for intervention in the future. And then for data science, synthesis, communication, and implementation, that's just simply the capacity to provide supports to whoever wants and needs information, whether it's detailed research that takes years to roll out, or summary statements that maybe take 6 months to write a white paper on, or whatever that might, or going to a panel and advising a panel of decision makers on with an options analysis and a set of recommendations. Lots of interventions could be constructed there that have themselves different timescales involved. And then your conversations were rather more complex, and we don't have time to go into those. So I'm just going to show you two examples of how that complexity in these two categories, with my takeaways on the topics that were discussed in Reno, can branch out into considerable complexity that could be explored. And it could be a pretty exciting opportunity to explore the complexity in some way, to get deeper into these issues and write papers and make presentations and do gap analysis that you put into policy panels, whatever that might look like. So one example for the water allocate for research extension and education is that could be doing activities or work around, well, forecasting. What does that look like and how do you make it better and more relevant? Educational gaps and professional development. We talked about that briefly, about how you train the next generation of professionals who are going to support water security in the West. And then community acceptance of the need for change. And I covered that substantially in earlier comments. So that kind of complexity could arise inside that water topic. In this water topic, it's really what get our minds and hearts around what does the culture and the color of water mean, and how does that translate into specific work topics, whatever that might look like multiple use of water, And I'm not in your arena entirely, so I'm speaking maybe a bit out of school here, but a lot of questions there about how you operationalize the notion of achieving a huge, broad, unmeasurable goal like instituting the culture and color of water. Groundwater banking and recharge could be a specific activity, collaborative joint management arrangements, so interbasin, interdisciplinary, just straight out cooperation between neighbors, whatever that might look like at different scales itself. And then management of uncertainty. I come from the fisheries management background where managing uncertainty is really a huge topic. And so I was warmed my heart and soul when those of you in Reno started talking about and identifying the whole question of uncertainty as its own explicit topic worth maybe exploring in some ways. So what is it about water management that is uncertain, and how do we manage explicitly uncertainty, leading to maybe some constructive future-oriented thinking, like what does adaptive management look like when you're managing uncertainty around water security? Lots of good, rich detail and complexity could come out under any of these categories that we've talked about. So let's flip forward to the number 4 in our mind map, and that recall that one of the work modules in the Reno meeting was talking about the Water Congress itself, and chose to use the word interactivity here because as a meeting planner, I'm always thinking about when I host a meeting or help design a meeting, what's the interactivity that needs to occur amongst the participants to get good things to happen. So me thinking and projecting myself forward into 2023 and facilitating a meeting like that, what is the interactivity that would help that conversation be productive and constructive? This is just another set of examples of what interactivity could look like in the 2023 Water Congress, simply around the notions of resolving aspirations versus feasibility inside the Western water network. So it's the age-old question of narrowing the focus to make it manageable for an organization. So you're not too broad, that you try to do everything, and when you try to do everything, you accomplish nothing. So that question is on the table. The One Water theme could be an interactivity in the meeting, and how that comes to pass in reality on the ground. Somebody in the flip chart notes, I only recall one person writing this in there, but it really rose to the top of it impressed me, and it rose to the top of my thinking. Was really behind all of this is climate change, but we're just not making it explicit. That conversation has been alive and well in your leadership team in the Western Water Network, but in our Congress, it wasn't too explicitly covered, except this one person brought it to my attention. So I thought I'd bring it back to your attention. Maybe there's something in an interactivity around climate change intersecting with water security in the West, and what on earth you're going to do about it. Focus on collaborating and leveraging across scales should be self-evident from our prior discussion. Communicating risks with stakeholders and developing their trust. That's the whole notion of community engagement. How to cause water management behavior change. Now, I think that's on everybody's minds, but there seems to be, I didn't detect that anybody was working on it. In another side of my life, for example, I hang out with people who think about behavior change and economics and behavior change and natural resources management. And there's actually quite a bit of stuff that's going on there about how do you cause behavior change. And I know a fellow at Harvard that researches and teaches this stuff. And he says the iconic question that brings this home is when you ask people, do they want to leave the world a better place for their children? Everybody says yes. But then you ask them, what is it you can do to realize that or make it happen? Nobody has any ideas, or they're in denial that they need to do it. So we have a disconnect between aspiration statements, we want to leave the world a better place, and our activity choices, we don't make the right choices. So there's lots maybe in behavior change. And that could be an interactive module in the Congress as well. And then lastly, a whole unsiloing the existing work centers could be a really nice and rich topic in the Congress about how you make that happen. Probably don't reprise that it is happening. Maybe begin with an a priori assumption that it is happening. A little bit of work to define that, but a lot of work on how you unsilo things could be a fruitful activity in the Congress. Again, the stuff on the right is just an example list that people like you can take from all the stuff that's been done to date, the starting line and the paper by Travis and so forth, and end up creating some detailed topics like this that could be interactivity modules in the Congress. The fifth thing was the Water Congress deliverables themselves. Again, as a meeting planner, I'm always thinking about how uncomfortable I am if I am asked to design a meeting that is just to talk about things and not produce a work product. I'm more than willing to do that, of course, but I'm always agitating. What's the concrete and actionable deliverable, the physical thing you can put your hands on that needs to come out of a meeting that can have a life of its own and be fruitful in impacting the future? And that could be a paper, it could be a task team, it could be a negotiation, it could be a variety of different things. Our conversation about deliverables in Reno seemed to mostly reify what our leadership team has come up with already. We're going to look at the bottom part of this list first. And those are two potential concrete products. One is a synthesis paper that the leadership team would take some sort of leadership on, either authoring it or co-authoring it with people. A little unclear about whether that should be a proceedings, a review document that's published in a peer-reviewed journal, a book, or some sort of other kind of report. And then in front of the synthesis paper, a series of white papers, we're calling them, for lack of a better term, that are specific issue status reports and gap analysis that are prepared by invited sessions or invited authorship. Once that's sort of rolling, then we go back up to the top part of this list and think about, well, what might be potential tracks in the Water Congress? So we don't have to have just one single Congress. We can have multiple tracks. And the three that seem to come up in your discussions in Reno and that our leadership talked about after the Reno meeting was that there could be a track of functional planning for just the Western Water Network. What does its committees and their operations look like? Second track could be resource planning. That's taking the priority water topics and deciding initially anyway, what can be done about them. And the third is defining some specific Western Water Network initial work areas. And these could be very directed very directed programs that have measurable specific objectives. So there are programs like establishing an accreditation program for water professionals in the West. And so that would be a very tangible product that has very specific objectives that are measurable. Did we or did we not create an accreditation program that people are using? Something like that. And then the lastly in the mind map is the post-Reno request. Thank you so much for leaning in on that discussion and giving us your need statement. Clearly, you want us to stay connected to the developing work we're doing on the network. Today is an example of us trying to do that. And you want us to create a roadmap. You want us to start working on funding for the network, secure contact points. So that's how you knit the net, how our networks knits the networks, other networks together. A lot of knits in that, but I hope you understood it. Create some operational tools like a Western Water Network, and there's more to come on that. Clearly, though, the sentiment is the past is not serviceable for the future, and the question is, what can we do to design a future that's more workable? Well, this is where you may fit in. We're thinking there's room for you and other professionals in the West to join in work efforts to facilitate the whole process by first joining a Congress organizing committee. The second place that people could fit in is talk about value and capacity. That we would give it the name of a committee, but that's really to take all this huge detail that I've said is out there and winnow that down to something manageable for the Congress likely. In what are the tracks or the topics that should be covered. A little bit uncertain about what this committee's work product would be, but somebody has to wrestle with that complexity and winnow it down to a manageable array of topics to cover in the Congress. And then a finance committee. Organizations always need stable financing, so there's probably some real merit in making sure that happens. Well, that raises the question then of where do you fit in? And so I'd like to bring you into the picture by considering who is the Western Water Network. Well, by all stretches of my thinking, it's really you and people like you, where this is the time when the Western Water Network moves from this leadership team into something broader, yet to be defined. And so we're going to be considering, hopefully in today's conversations, a bit about what that you means and how we make that happen. So this is what the meeting looked like with a bunch of interactivity. It's a good bellwether of what future work by our committees might look like. It's people getting together, having great discussions, developing work products, thinking outside the box, generating ideas and collaborations, but all in aid of heading towards some sort of common mission that maybe needs some more work, but we need to end up with, there's a common mission that everybody across the West in this new network of networks can get behind. And if there's agreement on the mission, then all the wherewithal to make it happen is just a lot easier.